This weekend marked 6 months since the October 7th attacks on Israel and the start of the Israel-Hamas war. Senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute, Hussein Ibish, makes the case in a new article in The Atlantic. The rift has been created for the first time in modern memory between the United States and Israel, who are at odds over long-term visions and goals, as Israel's most territorial ambitions are coming into ever greater and more direct conflict with U.S. strategic interests.
Joining us now to discuss the current and future relationship between the United States and Israel is senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute, Hussein Ibish. Thanks for joining us.
What a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, how would you characterize this shift that many have observed just over the last week or so, where now you have people like Nancy Pelosi signing on to a letter that would condition aid to Israel, military aid to Israel, on certain humanitarian precautions being taken?
Well, I think what we're looking at is a degree to which the U.S.-Israeli rift on over Gaza, over where the war in Gaza is going, and how it should proceed from now, and kind of the imperative of the administration and its democratic allies to kind of wind the war down, both for U.S. strategic interests in the region, which have been badly harmed by the war, and also because of domestic politics, because it's really not in the interest of Joe Biden and the Democrats to have this war going on, say, in the summer when the real campaigning begins for the presidential election. So there's a lot of pressure building from Democrats on Netanyahu to begin to pull back and to ease the political pressure on Biden here at home in particular, and also to give the U.S. more space to kind of rebuild its strategic interests in the region.
May I ask, just as a quick follow-up, what do you see as America's strategic interest in the region? Because this is a big question front of mind as folks watch Joe Biden seem to bury himself kind of domestically, politically, by having such a close relationship with Israel and Netanyahu in particular, that doesn't seem to be necessitated for any obvious reason.
Well, it's complicated, right? Because strategic interests get refracted through political lenses, like who is to define a strategic interest. And a lot of times it gets defined politically as well as kind of in terms of the national interest, and the two kind of bleed together. But I do think we have a traditional sense that in the American interests in the region do include Israel's security, but also the free flow of oil, counterterrorism, and increasingly, I think, in recent years, the maritime security in these strategic choke points around the Arabian Peninsula, the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, the Bab el-Mandab Strait around the Gulf of Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal at the other end of the Red Sea leading into the Mediterranean. Now, these are three of the world's 8 main commercial shipping sort of maritime choke points. And the U.S. has been dominant. The U.S. has had a kind of naval dominance in that area for a long time. It's one of the biggest competitive advantages with China, because China gets more than 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and more than 40% of its manufactured imports aimed at Europe and North America go through the other side, go through the Bab el-Mandab Strait and the Suez Canal. So for us to kind of have a security, be the security guarantors there, is a major interest as well. I think that at a certain point, what we're really interested in is stability and security in the region. We are a status quo power. And what that has meant is a real focus on bringing together our strongest military ally, which is Israel, and the great financial and cultural and religious power of Saudi Arabia in a closer relationship under a kind of U.S. umbrella. And this war has messed that up completely. I'm sure Hamas was hoping to achieve that effect, but Israel has helped them do that by kind of going overboard in a way that has not been helpful to the United States.
You know, previous administrations of U.S. Presidents, including Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, did in fact rein Israel in at various points. The bombings in Lebanon, Reagan said enough's enough at some point. Why has the Biden administration, for at least a somewhat long period of time, if they're now maybe changing course, really seem to give, to my mind at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, the current Israeli administration more of a free hand, offered less criticism for a longer period of time.
Well, you're not wrong at all, and your examples are good ones, and there are others. Right. So I think that's true. I think it's really complicated, but the main reason has been there are two. One is the really strong sense among both Democrats and Republicans, on Capitol Hill, that October 7 was a unique event. And there's sort of an emotional and political desire to give Israel the widest berth to respond to it as it sees fit, because it was so kind of like people compare it to 9/11 or something like that. Now, there are many problems with that analogy, et cetera, but I think that's how it was conceptualized at first. The bigger reason, though, is that the administration's response to the Gaza war has been one of conflict containment. I think from the outset they thought, look, anything that happens in Gaza, as long as it stays in Gaza, we can cope with. I'm not sure that's true, but that was what they thought. And the main thing that could threaten U.S. interests over the medium and long term is for the war to spread, say, into Lebanon, to involve Hezbollah in a way that could drag in the United States and Iran and set off a regional conflict. And so I think the administration was very much focused on preventing the Israelis from escalating the war and expanding it into Lebanon by attacking Hezbollah, which a lot of his senior Israeli figures have wanted to do since early October or mid-October. The defense minister keeps pushing for it, and others have wanted to do it. And I think the U.S. bear hug of support has been very helpful in allowing the Biden administration to say, look, we support you on Gaza, but not in expanding the war to Lebanon. We support you in many ways, but we're telling you we won't support this, so don't do it. And I think there's been a sense that the main goal until recently was to prevent the war from spreading. But I also think that in the recent weeks, there's been a sense that the war has gone on too long, it's gone too far, and that it's now damaging everyone, including Israel's interests, and it needs to be ratcheted back. And the U.S. has put, gradually increasing pressure on the Israelis to pull back. It hasn't been anything as dramatic as Reagan's phone call during the 1982 war, or other instances where the U.S. has simply kind of pulled the plug. Because I think there is still that sense that, okay, conflict containment is the main goal. But at the same time, you're seeing the U.S. giving strong signals to the Israelis that enough is enough.
Mr. Ibish, you speak to U.S. interest being in the conflict not spreading. That doesn't seem to be, at least based on their behavior, Israel's interest, obviously, with last week's attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. What is the motive? What are the incentives? What is the benefit to Israel for escalating in this way?
Well, that attack has to be judged on its own terms, because I think that was part of a kind of the shadow war that Israel and Iran have been conducting against each other in the gray zone for the last sort of 3 or 4 years, coming out into the open more obviously. They were the people who were killed, including one of the senior-most commanders there, they believe was directing the way in which Iran's regional network, the Houthis and Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon and other pro-Iranian forces have been kind of working with Hamas to try to bolster their war effort, and they kind of considered him a combatant in a way, and so they attacked him and killed him, and that I think can be taken as a standalone. I think what's more significant are the ways in which the Israelis have been escalating in Lebanon at almost every turn. And it's been very clear for months now that Hezbollah does not want a war with Israel under current circumstances, and that Iran does not want Hezbollah in Lebanon to have a war with Israel under current circumstances, and that the United States does not want Israel to have a war with Hezbollah under current circumstances, but that there are people in Israel who do want that. And the motive would be to provide Israelis with a win. There's been a sense since October 7 that the Israeli psyche has been damaged, that the Israeli sense of security, of strength, of power in the region has been dealt a crucial blow. even by a ragtag militia that just kind of went, from place to place, shooting people over a day or two. And that's not sort of like a major threat to the survival of the Israeli state, but it did give a lot of Israelis, especially in the south of Israel, a sense of vulnerability, a sense of statelessness, almost like Palestinians in a way, a feeling of not having a government to look after them, at least for a couple of days. That really shook Israelis to the core. And I think Israeli leaders have been looking for a way to deliver them a win, to give them a sense of power again, to re-empower them psychically. And if this sounds crude, that's just how people think. The win is not coming in Gaza. There is nothing. What would take to control Gaza in the long run is to stay there forever. That's not a win, and that's a big problem for Israel. So I think they've been looking for another place to get a win, and I think right now the thinking is the win could come by bloodying Hezbollah in Lebanon, by just smashing it up a lot and leaving, and that could deliver the Israelis a psychic win. There's one other thing. I think Israelis are kind of hoping that a regional war could drag in the U.S. and Iran and deliver the long-sought but not yet achieved U.S. strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities that they've been pushing for 20 years. That's a long shot, but I think they are hopeful.
You've written that Israel is at a fork in the road. It can consolidate its affiliation with Washington and strengthen it through partnership with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, or it can commit to gobbling up occupied territory, expelling Palestinians, and the like. Could you comment on that? And could you comment on Netanyahu's current poll numbers suggesting widespread dissatisfaction with him, even among hardline people in Israel, frankly, people who I think are still absolutely quite committed to the war against Hamas, simultaneously deciding that Netanyahu might not be the right person for that job?
Netanyahu is very unpopular. He failed on October 7th, and I think the extent of his failure hasn't even been recognized by Israelis, but they do see that there was a government failure. Clearly a major security collapse, and they blame him. He's the prime minister. So more than that, though, if over time it's going to become clear to the majority of Israelis, if they really do an investigation, that his policies of keeping Hamas in power in Gaza, but contained and cut down to size periodically, and Fatah in power in the West Bank, in self-ruled areas of the West Bank, but humiliated and made to look ridiculous, etc., was this divide and rule strategy led directly to October 7, predictably, almost inevitably to October 7. And his sort of indirect responsibility for that bloodbath is much greater than even most Israelis have come to recognize. However, there is a real commitment to the war by most Israelis, because I think they feel they need to respond to this, and they don't. The fact that their country doesn't have a political goal, the fact that this is a war without a purpose for Israel, at least in terms of an articulatable, achievable political goal, which is what would define any war for any actor. The fact that it's not there is not really widely understood in Israel. I think most people have been caught up in all the rhetoric about destroying Hamas and whatnot. The broader agenda about annexation in the West Bank, which has been the policy of this government from its outset, is that it completely rejecting a two-state solution and looking forward to the day when Israel does gobble up a lot of the West Bank formally as well as informally, is a very dangerous thing, because it runs diametrically opposed to any strategic vision the United States has for strengthening its alliance in the region. It really will block any opening with Saudi Arabia. It will sentence Israel to endless decades and maybe centuries of warfare with Palestinians and more October 7th. And it basically puts the acquisition of territory by force over all other values. But there is this religious sensibility and historical irredentism in Israel that pushes in that direction. Now, whether the fact that the center at this point in Israel, the political center, has gained ground at the expense of the far right, eventually translates into a new government that's more centrist, and even if it's committed to continuing the war in Gaza, doesn't want to annex large amounts of territory in the West Bank. That could really be a breakthrough for the U.S., for Israeli-Arab relations, for Israel's future, etc. But it's going to take a lot because in recent years, Israel has been very right of center, and the Israeli political system has helped to hyper-empower the further right-wing groups. So I think Israel is at this crossroads, and one of the Biden administration's policies has been to try to get Israelis to see that, is to try to bear in upon Israelis that, look, you could go this way, and it will be better for you and us and everybody, or you can go that way, and ultimately you're going to be on your own. And I think they've had partial success at most. This is something that Israelis are going to have to come to on their own. But the Gaza war ought to help clarify a lot of it. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you so much. Going to have to leave it there, but we really appreciate you joining us, Hussein Ibish. Thank you so much.
Thank you.